On the wall of a cave in France, there is a horse, painted 20,000 years ago in the dark by someone who would never see it again. And sitting on the horse's back, like a parking ticket on the windshield of a masterpiece, are four small dots. For as long as these caves have been studied, the experts looked at those dots and wrote down, in effect, decoration. Next to a leaping bull, some lines, decoration. Beside a fish, a little Y shape, decoration. The most photographed paintings on the planet had something written on the animals' backs, and the official scientific position was that it was random squiggles, which is the phrase you reach for when you have a PhD, and the honest answer is, I don't know, maybe it's pretty. Then a man in London who repairs broken furniture for a living looked at the same dots and did the one thing nobody had bothered to do. He counted them. Every list you've ever written down so you wouldn't forget it traces back to somebody, somewhere, deciding a mark on a surface could hold a fact. And the man who found the oldest version of that, a furniture restorer, no degree, working from his living room, ended up reading the diary of people who died 20,000 years before the alphabet. The number of marks turned out to be a date. The dots beat the oldest writing anyone agrees on by 10,000 years. To get there, you have to meet the people who left them because they weren't decorating, they were keeping records. And the thing they could not afford to get wrong was time. 20,000 years ago, missing the salmon run by 2 weeks wasn't a bad afternoon. It was a bad winter, which in the Ice Age meant you didn't make it to spring. Ice Age Europe was a cold open plain. Mammoth, bison, wild horse, reindeer, and people in small bands following the food. No shops, no buffer, and almost everything that kept you alive ran on a clock you did not control. The reindeer rut in autumn. The salmon come up the rivers in a narrow window and then they're gone. The mares foal in spring. The bison drop their calves in a few short weeks and not a day longer. These were people running in their heads the single most important spreadsheet in their lives. One column, one row per season, and every cell was fill in or starve. When does the herd come through the valley? When is the river worth standing in? A modern person panics about a calendar invite. An Ice Age hunter-gatherer had the same anxiety, except the meeting was 1,000 reindeer, and the penalty for being late was death. People had figured out, long before these caves, that the inside of a human head was not a safe place to keep the thing your life depended on. Notched bones, tally marks carved into antler and ivory, go back tens of thousands of years, some of them older than these paintings. Somebody, deep in the Ice Age, sat down and scratched a row of marks into a piece of antler so they wouldn't lose count, the world's oldest to-do list, written by a man who did not have a word for list and would not have one for another 19,000 years. Bennett Bacon is not a doctor of anything. His day job is reattaching the legs of 200-year-old cabinets. For generations, the dots sat in the caves, filed under abstract signs, which is the academic phrase for "we have no idea, please stop asking." Then Bacon, in his spare time, instead of relaxing like a normal person, downloaded every image of marked cave art he could find through the British Library and the internet, and started staring, not at the horses, at the dots on the horses. He built a database of them at his own table for no money and no credit anyone had promised him, which is either heroic curiosity or a cry for help, and the only record of which one it was is the database, which he also built. The professionals knew the dots were decoration because that's what their teachers had told them, and their teachers' teachers. Bacon had never been taught that, so he did the thing nobody had done in a century and a half. He counted, and the sequences never, ever ran past 13. Never 14, never 20, capped every time at 13, which happens to be the number of lunar months that fit inside a year. A dot equals 1 month. You count them from spring, when the year visibly restarts. Bacon took it to people who could check him. Two Durham University professors, Paul Pettit and Robert Kentridge, and Tony Freeth, the man who spent years reconstructing the ancient Greek Antikythera mechanism. So, not a soft touch. They published it together in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in January 2023, a journal that normally runs 300-page arguments about pottery, now printing with a straight face that the dots mean Tuesday. The claim is gorgeous in its plainness. The number of marks beside an animal isn't a tally of how many you killed or a decoration of its coat. It's a date. It says this many months after spring. And the little Y shape, the one filed under decoration for 150 years, the team argues is a tiny picture of birth, two legs spreading apart the way they do when an animal is born. Where the Y sits in the row tells you the birthing month. The cave paintings, the dawn of imagination, the thing on the inspirational poster, were underneath a date. A typical entry reads, horse, mates month 3, births month 1. It is the Ice Age equivalent of a sticky note on the fridge that says, salmon, 3rd week of June, bring everyone. And they used the animal as the row the date belonged to, because of course you file the salmon run under the salmon. The oldest writing anyone had agreed to call writing, the clay tokens and tablets of the ancient Middle East, shows up around 5,000 years ago. Bacon's dots, if they hold, beat that by 10,000. Not a tweak to the timeline, a doubling of it. The whole story of when humans started recording information outside their own skulls lurches back to a cold cave lit by a tallow lamp. And the system is not small. Across the analysis, there are over 600 sequences of lines and dots, and over 250 carrying that Y, the same shape, the same meaning, maintained across what is now France and Spain for thousands of years. No email thread, no style guide, nobody standardized the Y. They just all agreed, which is a level of editorial consensus no committee in human history has managed since, and nobody involved even had a word for meeting. A continent of people all using the same 3 signs to write down the same thing, when. And the name now attached to pushing literacy back 10,000 years belongs to a man with no degree, no department, and no one above him to ask permission. Human beings are pattern machines, and the patterns are not always there. In the 1980s, a cluster of childhood leukemia cases turned up near a set of power lines, and the shape of it was so clean that it triggered lawsuits, panic, and years of research before the epidemiologists worked out the cluster was random noise, and the only real pattern was in the people staring at the map. A man who spends years staring at dots in a cave is exactly the person who would find a calendar in there, and also exactly the person who would find a calendar in a parking lot, a water stain, a bowl of cereal, which is why not everyone buys it. Real archaeologists, April Noel at Victoria, Melanie Chang at Portland State, looked at the same dots and said, slow down. Maybe the Y isn't birth. Maybe it's just a bit of the animal's actual coat, and we're reading a calendar into a cow's markings. Others went back to the original caves and found that some of the tracings Bacon worked from were old and a little off. A line that looked lined up with a mammoth wasn't really once you stood in front of the rock, so it might not be writing. The dots might mean less than the story wants them to. The skeptics aren't really asking whether Bacon is right. They're asking whether the dots made him right, or he made the dots right, which is an excellent question, and one that 20,000-year-old rocks are not going to answer. But notice what already happened, regardless of who wins. For 150 years, the dots were filed under nothing, and nobody checked. Then one untrained man counted them, and now professors at 3 universities are standing in front of actual cave walls arguing about what a Y means. The marks went from invisible to contested, which is the entire difference between a thing science ignores and a thing science fights about. So go back to the horse. 20,000 years old, 4 dots on its back, painted by someone in the dark who needed to remember when the herds would come, and who solved that the way we still solve it, by writing the date down where they'd see it. We don't know their names, we'll probably never agree on exactly what they wrote, but somebody, with cold hands and a flickering lamp, was keeping count because the count was the difference between eating and not. That spreadsheet is 20,000 years old and 3 dots wide. It still runs. The oldest message in the world had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, and it took a man with no training in a magnifying glass to notice the dots were never the doodle. Bacon, for his part, went back to repairing furniture, though one does worry a little about the man who taught himself to read a calendar in 4 dots, now alone in a workshop, turning a cabinet leg over in his hands, looking very hard at the grain. We were never the ones who couldn't read. We just never counted.